When voters think about a president's performance in office, the first thing most of them think about is the economy. President Biden is 2.5 years into his presidency, so what is the state of Bidenomics? My guest this episode is Ed Gresser. Ed is a vice president at PPI, and he focuses on trade and economic policy, and he's the author of a recent paper out of PPI about Bidenomics. And he joins the show to discuss Bidenomics, and we talk about all sorts of stuff in this episode. We discuss the biggest economic stories from the last few years, how President Biden stacks up, and how we should grade him in areas like stimulus spending, inflation, trade, and many more economic areas. And we discuss where the administration is succeeding and where they are failing and where they need to shift their focus. We always appreciate your support. If you want to drop a like, a comment, a subscription, a review on the podcast, that's always appreciated. If you want to support us even further, you can do so at patreon.com/neoliberalpodcast. You can also support us by becoming a member of the Center for New Liberalism at cnliberalism.org/become a member. Becoming a member lets you get involved in your local organizing group. It gets you access to bonus episodes, to our organizer Slack. It's a great resource, and we hope you become a member. As always, thank you for listening, and we hope you enjoy the episode. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the New Liberal Podcast, part of the Center for New Liberalism. I'm your host, Jeremiah Johnson, and joining me this episode is Ed Gresser. Ed, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much. Great to be here.
All right, so today we're talking about Bidenomics and the Biden economic agenda and how the economy is performing and what Biden's policies have had to do about that. And I want to start with what I think is probably the single biggest factor in the Biden economy over the last 3 years, and that is the decision that was kind of made, honestly, between the Trump administration and the Biden administration, that we were going to have a big, really big, significant set of direct interventions in the economy to help combat the COVID recession. How do you think about that? Because, you know, at the time we went really big. We went much bigger than we did for the Great Recession in 2008. We'd sent a lot more money directly to people. The total size of these, bills that were passed was a lot bigger. But some people have started arguing, was it too big? Could we have gone smaller? So to me, that's like the biggest, most gigantic story of the economy of the past few years. How do you think about that when you're kind of grading Bidenomics?
Well, I would put it this way. Generally, to be most direct, I think they made the right call. To be a little bit more elaborate, COVID pandemic was a very unusual event. We have not had something like that. I think people say since a pandemic flu just at the end of World War I. We had very little experience with it. There were a million Americans died of COVID.
It's very odd how it was almost 100 years on the dot.
Yeah. And in cases like that, my view is government will have to act quickly. It should act forcefully, and it'll have to act without having all the information it would usually like to have. And so sometimes you make some mistakes and you look back and, well, we could have done this a little bit differently, or that didn't work so well. But fundamentally, when you look at the campaign the White House is doing for Bidenomics, the things that they say up front about the economy today are true. That unemployment is low, that workforce participation rates have risen substantially, that we have grown faster than all of the other G7 economies. And I think that validates the choice you're talking about. I think it's certainly possible to go back and say, maybe they overshot a bit. But at the time, in the end of 2020, beginning of 2021, it's hard to really fine-tune your choices. And you have to be willing to accept that the government may do a little too much or a little bit too little, and it'll have to clean up some things afterwards because of that. But it's hard to be precisely on the dot in a case like that. And so I judge the administration pretty positively for its response to the COVID pandemic in its first year.
One of the ways I've heard that expressed is that, if you think of the risk in, say, 2020 or 2021, and you're trying to pass these big bills, there's a risk to going too small, and there's also a risk to going too big. But the risk to going too small was probably a lot worse than the risk of going too big.
Yes, I think that's a very good way to express it. There have been some overhangs from all of this. We've had a kind of persistently high level of inflation. I think the administration probably deserves a bit more criticism for not cleaning it up as vigorously as it might. But the basic choice to say we want to bring unemployment down quickly, we want to take care of people while they're sitting at home, we want to make sure that when restaurants send their people home, they don't close down forever, and that all happened. So I think they should feel pretty good, and the public should feel, the Biden administration did the right thing.
It's very interesting that we had the Great Recession, about a decade before this happened, 12 years, I guess, because the story of the Great Recession, in hindsight, is that, we didn't do enough. And in some ways, we did a lot. The Federal Reserve certainly pioneered all sorts of novel techniques and quantitative easing, and they were doing new stuff they'd never done before. But in terms of fiscal stimulus, just money that Congress was willing to spend, it certainly looks like, more than a decade later, that during the 2008 crisis, we didn't do enough. And you saw this kind of very long, very slow recovery that essentially lasted the entire Obama administration, all 8 years, where the economy was always getting better under Obama, but very slowly, 1% a year, the unemployment rate would go down, right?
Yeah.
And I think we learned
that people didn't feel it was good. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think we learned that it didn't have to be that slow.
Yeah, I think in that case too. Try to put yourself in the minds of the Federal Reserve and the last months of the Bush administration, the first year of Obama. They put a lot of political capital and paid a pretty high political price for rescuing the banking system, for bailing out the auto companies. Those decisions, in retrospect, look to me like good ones, but very costly ones. They didn't put as much money into ordinary people in daily life, and maybe they didn't have the political capital left to do it. But I think you're right that did put a pretty heavy burden on the Obama presidency. And you have to look back and say, what lessons do we learn from that? And the Biden administration learned the lesson that we don't want a long, slow recovery. We want to get back to normal quick.
And like you said, I think it's important to come back to what are the actual indicators we're looking at, and how do they compare with other countries? And the U.S. has had faster growth post-COVID than, any other big economy, and arguably even faster growth at this point than China, which is shocking because the story of China is always that, they're smaller economy than us, but growing faster, and they're going to catch us one day. But now it looks like the U.S. might actually be growing faster than China. And, we've got more people working. And so the indicators look pretty good, all except for one, which is inflation. And that's probably the second big story here, right? If there's got to be another dominant story of the Biden economy, it's that we do have the highest inflation for the past 30 years. And that's kind of the same story as the story of the stimulus.
Yes, it is. You put a lot of money into the economy. You give consumers and families a lot of money to spend. You give businesses a lot of money to spend, and they, a lot of them spent it, and so that has had a pretty lasting effect. And we can still see elevated food prices. The inflation rate for most of our lifetimes has been 1 or 2%. There was a point at which it got up to 10% year on year, and when I was growing up and I was in high school, that was a high inflation period.
You're dating yourself here,
because
there hasn't been one for a while.
But there's a reason for it. You said people hated it. it was really dispiriting. It was really, made people feel policy is not competent. My paycheck, which I was not old enough to be getting, but people did feel like my paycheck is going to be lower by the time I carry it to the bank, because people did in those days, than it is when I get it. And that really kind of eroded confidence in government and to extend in the country. So inflation is something that you really have to take seriously. I think the Biden administration, most important thing it's done in inflation is to let the Federal Reserve go about its business of raising rates and bringing down demand, and not be screeching and yelling like a particular other person that would obviously be doing that. So I think that is a very responsible and admirable and good management of the presidency. I would also say, though, that they have left some things on the table. They have not canceled, for example, Trump's tariffs. They remain committed to a very aggressive Buy American program for domestic infrastructure spending, and that tends to drive up prices. So there are things that the Biden administration could have done that they didn't, and changes to their program that they could have made without much pain that they decided not to make for, I assume, political reasons. And so, if the public is blaming Biden for inflation, they're not really 100% correct, but they're not 100% wrong either. There is more the administration could have done.
I think there's this thing that I've said, I guess, a couple times on the podcast that, I always think that when you're in politics, to some extent, you're always fighting the war from 10 years ago. And in the case of, how much money should we spend, a little bit or a lot, the 2008 experience actually helped us because we realized that, 10 years ago, we didn't do enough. So now we're going to do a lot. We had kind of learned our lesson. And so that was a good thing. But with inflation, it just seems like it was so far past our frame of reference politically. We haven't had to deal with inflation being high for I guess literally almost 40 years, since the early 1980s, that I think politically we just forgot how much people hate it. People really do despise it. And I think genuinely economists and politicians forgot that we can talk about how a little bit of rise in inflation is okay. But no, people just despise it, at their core.
I think I'd say a couple of things. Not all economists were blasé about this. I think you can point to Larry Summers and Adam Posen at Peterson Institute, who were pretty alert to this and pretty worried about it right at the beginning. Also, I think in the political system, that was something that the Biden administration owes some gratitude to Senator Manchin for really focusing on this issue during all of the budget and spending bill debates. But yes, I think you're right that people in the political system, had lost a bit of the awareness they had of how sensitive this is. And when you are kind of an ordinary person, almost at any level of income, you go to a grocery store and you see the price of food much higher, you get anxious and you get upset. And people are also very sensitive to the price of gasoline. And in particular, for the type of audience that the administration is looking to for its Bidenomics Work campaign, working class people, blue collar people, people without college degrees, not all overall, but in general, they make somewhat less money than more educated people, and they are going to be particularly sensitive, and their actual real world budgets will be particularly sensitive to inflation in the types of things that they're buying from day to day.
So I want to take a quick detour because mostly we're talking here about Bidenomics. And, as I mentioned in the intro, there's going to be this upcoming paper on Bidenomics coming out of PPI that you are the author of. And so we're mostly interested here in talking about Biden's policies and Biden's decisions. But I do think we should spend at least one question talking about Jerome Powell as well, because you can't really talk about inflation without talking about the Federal Reserve. And so if I was going to ask about that, I think I would just ask you two things. Number one, Do you think Jerome Powell has done a good job? Do you think that we are going to be having that soft landing that everybody's dreaming of? Because it looks more likely now than it has in a long time. And should we think of inflation just as a Federal Reserve thing, or should it also be something that we expect the president to act on as well? Does it make sense to blame the president for inflation? You know, how do you think about like apportioning the blame or the credit for high inflation or for fixing inflation? Like, who gets blame and credit there?
Okay, well, to your first point, I'm quite impressed by Powell on this. He's been calm and explaining the Federal Reserve's view of the economy and has not been sort of deterred by the kind of screeching and berating of Trump, or by more polite and well-founded concerns more recently. So I think he's done what he and the board think is correct. And you have seen over this past year, month by month, the inflation rates going down. They're not all the way back to where the Federal Reserve wants to see it. And so I think there's still work to do. You can always have unexpected events that unsettle your plans. But I think by and large, the Federal Reserve looks pretty good. In terms of the things that administrations can do, I would say often presidents get blamed for inflationary things that are entirely beyond their control. This is particularly the case with gasoline.
It's probably the worst fact of politics that the price of gasoline almost determines how popular the president is in some instances.
Yes, and that's that is really out of the president's control. These are things that bounce around for all sorts of reasons, because of events in the Middle East, or because of earthquakes, or because of weather, and that presidents just have to live with that. The most important thing administration can do is to be calm and supportive of Federal Reserve policies that it believes are appropriate in the circumstances, and not to try to make a kind of scapegoat of the Federal Reserve for doing things that are basically correct. And I think the Biden administration has been very responsible there. I think when you look at Janet Yellen, when you look at Lael Brainerd, the White House, these are very professional people. Secretary Raimondo, the president himself, kind of setting a tone. This has been done quite well. That said, fiscal policy and tariff policy also have some effects. The administration, when it got started, had a really heartfelt and valuable commitment to public investment in infrastructure, which it stuck to. As part of that, it has wanted to do a lot of what they call Buy American policies, of saying we will only accept U.S. bids for particular building materials and things. And that tends to drive up the prices, and that is probably something they should have reconsidered. Trump administration tariffs, depending on who you look to, probably raised inflation rates by 0.3% to highest estimate I've seen is 1.1. That in a world of 10% inflation, that's a minor factor, but it's not a zero factor. So there are some more things the administration could have done and has chosen not to.
I knew we would get to trade eventually. I know it's your first love in terms of all the great economic subjects we can cover. But so now that we've covered kind of the very biggest stories, because you can't talk about the economy the last few years without talking about the big investment bills and, the stimulus and the resulting inflation, I want to just toss it to you, because there's a lot of stuff in this report that's coming out. What else do you think, if you had to highlight, other than those two things, what is one of the biggest and most important economic stories that you've been focused on, for the last couple years? And how do you grade the Biden administration there? Now, I know there's a lot of directions we can go with this, but I'm curious, what's top of your mind?
Well, in terms of, in thinking of Bidenomics, there are a couple things that are top of my mind. I would say The most important thing is what we've been talking about: is how's the economy doing, year to year. I think they deserve pretty good grades for that. A second important thing is, what do you view as the drivers of growth in the coming years? And here, reading the Bidenomics literature, the speech President Biden gave in July, the document the White House put out, which is well worth reading. It's a very long title. Bidenomics is working. The president's plan grows the economy from the middle out and bottom up, not the top down, but it isn't very long. It's quite readable. There are a couple of problems that occur to me there. One is almost every problem in the economy of the country is kind of assumed to have a government spending or government regulation solution. There's very little attention to the role of the private sector. There's very little attention to the role of technological progress. There's no attention, at least in these documents, to the global economy, to the export sector, to competitiveness, those sorts of things. So I think the pitch the administration is making is much stronger for things are pretty good right now, and we deserve some credit for that, than it is for here's our plan to make things a lot better over the next 5 years by the time the second term finishes. That's sort of a taken, here's where we are now and here's where we'd like to go. They are also, I think, really not correctly describing where the other side wants us to go. You can see in the White House document, it's about 4 pages long, and they use the phrase trickle-down, failed trickle-down policy of the past 5 times, I believe. They talk about the last 40 years of trickle-down, those sorts of things. And I think that's really not a correct description of their likely opposition next year. They're presumably most likely to see Donald Trump. He is not a person who is very similar to the Republicans of the 1980s who said all this, in train in the documents that the White House puts out. They are really an argument with the Reagan administration, saying we have had too little public investment, government should be more active, and Trump in his term at the White House and next time has not been someone who's interested in cutting the role of government, deregulating, reducing spending. He was interested in increasing all those things as a way to bolster himself and his friends and to use the power of government against his political rivals and opponents.
Yeah, famously, he has, made the whole we're going to go back to, balancing the budget, and we're going to reform Medicare and Social Security. And he was the first one really in the Republican Party to step up and say, we're not going to do that. Your Social Security is perfectly safe with me. And, you can debate that whether or not that's good policy or whether or not that's realistic. But he was a break from the Paul Ryan kind of budget neutral, libertarian-ish kind of view of budgets, where he just said, hell, I'll run deficits all day because it benefits me,
Yes, he was a break from the approach that Paul Ryan had, a break from the approach that John McCain or Bob Dole had, and not similar in any way, except random coincidence, to the approach that Reagan had. So, the pitch that the opposition is trickle down and no interest in public spending, it doesn't add up to me, and it doesn't adequately describe the type of threat that I think Trumpism can pose to the country. So I think that is the
one thing I will say there is that the Republicans, and I think this has been consistently true for a long time, Republicans have never actually been interested in controlling spending. If you look at their actions and not their words, government spending grew under George Bush, both the first and the second. It grew under Reagan, it grew under Trump. And so in terms of how much the government is actually spending, that's true. But they do seem pretty dedicated to tax cuts. And in that formulation of like if the classic conservative ideal is we're going to cut spending and cut taxes, they don't ever really cut spending. But, George Bush did do a big tax cut. That's what he spent the Clinton surplus on, was cutting taxes. And Trump, basically only ever got one big bill passed. He wasn't able to repeal Obamacare. He wasn't able to do a lot. But his one big legislative accomplishment was that he cut taxes for rich people. And so for that part, I do think it's accurate that like they do want to do trickle down in the sense of cut people's taxes.
Yeah, I think that's fair. Where I think there is a problem is describing the last 40 years as 40 years of trickle down. That is missing a lot of policy of all sorts, and a lot of policy that President Biden was personally involved in, often with a lot of benefit to the country. If you think about Clean Air Act of 1990, if you think of the Americans with Disability Act, the big rollbacks of Reagan tax cuts came under Clinton. If you think about the child health insurance program, the child tax credit, the Affordable Care Act, to say that these last 40 years are kind of grim, unbroken period of trickle-down economics is not accurate. And you're describing really a sixth of American history in a way that doesn't make a lot of sense and doesn't kind of acknowledge that Biden was a part of this and should be taking credit for a lot of good things that happened then.
It's funny how quickly we run away from Bill Clinton's economy when, but before Joe Biden, that was the hottest economy we'd had in decades and decades, in generations, really. And it had super high employment and mostly low inflation and a lot of technological progress. And Bill Clinton was the only one who actually balanced the budget. And yet Democrats are mostly running away from that and yelling about how it's neoliberalism and stuff. But Bill Clinton was popular and he did a pretty good job by most accounts.
Yes, he was. He put a lot of policies into effect in the early 1990s. He won re-election by probably the largest re-election margin in my lifetime, with the exception of Reagan in 1984. Did a good job. A lot of good things to say about that.
All right, so I do want to talk about your personal favorite thing and your specialty, which is trade policy, tariff policy, and a lot of this kind of stuff. Because I think it's been an interesting focus of the Biden administration as well. I don't know that it's the biggest story, but, the big, like, sexy topics are like sending people checks in the mail and inflation and, let's argue about trickle down. And these are all kind of like politically sexy in the sense that you can put them in a headline and it'll get 1 million clicks and it'll go viral if you argue about trickle down or if you argue about sending people a $2,000 check. Those are all, it's very salient and it's very like top of mind for like average voters. And, tariffs and Buy America stuff, they're not as salient in that way. But the Biden administration has had a big focus on that. And it's really this whole package of stuff, right? It's sometimes tariffs and it's sometimes Buy America provisions where, you have to buy from American companies. You can't buy lumber from Canada if it's going to be used on a federal project because who knows, the Canadian trees aren't patriotic enough or whatever. And it's also, though, a renewed focus on stuff like industrial policy and building out the industrial base and trying to pick like key sectors where we're going to ban Chinese imports for geopolitical reasons. Do you consider that all kind of the same thing? Or are those like separate areas in your mind that should be judged separately?
I think there is a general kind of attitude and view of trade in the administration. The particular things you're mentioning are sometimes related to that, but sometimes sui generis. The case, for example, of Canadian lumber imports. This is a long-standing argument between the U.S. and Canada over the way Canadian forests are managed.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but is this one of like the stupidest long-running disputes we have. Like, it's just very dumb at its core. At least that's my impression of it. Am I wrong there?
It has an internal logic in the nature of U.S. trade laws, but I think it is correct to say that this is a long-running argument. I tried once to trace it back, and I found arguments about this as early as 1921. So it doesn't end.
Yeah, it's just one of those things that, like, when I think about like where we should be spending our energy on in trade policy and like what actually matters and what we should spend our time on, Canadian lumber just seems like the bottom of the list, and yet it is so. Nobody can shut up about it. We're going to be doing it 100 years from now. We're still going to be talking about Canadian trees. I don't know.
Yeah, well, I have some personal experience with this. I worked for a Montana senator in the 1990s, and I can attest Montana lumber mills cared a lot about this, and so people in Congress care about it. And when people in Congress care about something, administrations, I mean, they can tell Congress stop caring about this, but there's a price to pay for that. So that one, I think, is more a kind of long-standing feature of U.S.-Canadian relations, which in general are quite very large and pretty good. The innovation of the Biden administration is they are the first Democratic administration so far since at least James Buchanan, and maybe before that, not to be looking for tariff cuts in some way. I think they have drawn lessons from the past, which are maybe in a way parallel to types of lessons people draw from the 2008 stimulus package and so on, that both President Clinton and President Obama got involved in very emotional intra-party debates over trade policy. They were trying to do big things. In some cases succeeded, in some cases not. I think the Biden administration does not want to repeat the experiences that Clinton had over NAFTA and President Obama had over TPP. They are very close to organized labor, Democratic constituency groups in general, kind of left populist approaches who were very unhappy with the NAFTA, blame trade policy for falling levels of manufacturing employment. And so what they are trying to do is persuade people that trade policy probably shouldn't be at the center of policy, or shouldn't be at the center of economic policy. And in fact, there was a person on the National Security Council, I believe the economic deputy, a couple of months ago, gave a long presentation, said, well, we don't see tariff policy at the center of trade policy, and we don't see trade policy being at the center of international economic policy. And I think they found themselves without much to say, and not many people internationally or at home buying into this. And it is going to be difficult to defend that position against a Trump campaign, which will say, we are offering fire engine red isolationism. And
Trump has, I think, recently, just in the last week, said something like, I would put a 10% tariff on everything, on all goods coming in internationally, which would be like a return to like the 1920s or something like that. Like, it would be such a break with any modern trade policy, right?
Yeah, that'd be pretty similar. I mean, the trade policy of the 1920s, Warren Harding and Calvin Coolidge and Herbert Hoover was very much about that, saying we in the United States can't compete against low-wage foreign rivals in Europe and in China and Japan, and we have to have a tariff rate that's high enough to offset their wage advantages. And it didn't wind up well. And ever since then, up to the Trump administration, pretty much all U.S. presidents were engaged in a project of bringing down tariff rates internationally. And Biden administration's argument at the moment is we don't really need to be doing that. That's an issue kind of the past. We want to be putting more people to work in manufacturing, and that means not cutting tariffs. I think there's a lot of intellectual problems with this, but that is kind of where they are right now.
But what about things like, the bill that was passed to give a bunch of money to spur semiconductor construction in the United States, that we want to have a stronger semiconductor industry? Or, some people argue that we should be subsidizing wind and solar even more heavily than we do because China is out ahead of us on solar and batteries. What do you think about the administration's focus on those kind of industrial policy actions? Are you skeptical of them? Are you supportive? Is it nuanced?
I'm probably kind of in a nuanced camp. Nuance can kind of mean mushy-mouthed, and I hope that's not it. But here's basically my view is there seems to be a lot of consensus that the U.S. had become very, very reliant for semiconductors on quite a small number of sources, particularly Taiwan. And Taiwan is a very friendly place, good and close working relationship with U.S. science, good and close relationship with the U.S. government, very sensitive security area. The experience people draw on is during the COVID pandemic, the auto industry shut down faster than evidently they needed to. They fell out of the customer chain for semiconductor chips and had a lot of trouble getting back online. And so I think the administration and a lot of analysts in business and economics feel semiconductors are kind of a energy-like thing. You need access to it, and in contrast to energy, you can build it wherever you want. And I think there's a reasonable argument for what we've done. The case of requiring local building materials for infrastructure projects, I think, is much weaker. Those are things where I think you're looking for broad-based public benefit from more efficient economy, more productive economy, and requiring particular sources of particular things either raises the cost of it overall or diminishes the amount of new infrastructure you can get. So there, I'm pretty skeptical. The biggest one of all is the Inflation Reduction Act and its attempt to shift the country off of fossil fuel-based power and transportation systems and onto zero emission or very low emission systems. And there, I think in the big picture, it's probably correct to say that there's a lot of path dependence, and it's very difficult and expensive to move off of coal-fired power plants and internal combustion engines to renewables and nuclear and electric vehicles. And a government push is probably something that will make it much more likely to succeed than relying on market stimulus or market incentives alone. On the other hand, there's also a lot of internally contradictory policies. That in the case you mentioned of solar panels, there have been a lot of lawsuits under various trade laws to keep Chinese panels off the U.S. market, and to then argue that panels coming from Thailand and Vietnam and Cambodia are really Chinese-ish panels that are moving through those countries without a lot of change. And that, in the middle of 2022, almost brought U.S. solar deployment to a halt, because we suddenly had a specter the solar power companies were going to lose access to products they needed and might have to pay very exorbitant back tariffs. So there, in this world of moving to renewables and moving to zero emissions, the big picture case that you need a lot of energetic government is I think has a lot of force to it. But when you go down a few tiers, I mean, you find arguments. One, we need to shift quickly to these forms of energy and transport. And two, we need to make sure they're made in America. And those things don't fit together very well.
Yeah, I think that's where I come down as well. And like I've argued with this with like Noah Smith, for instance. And Noah is an economic commentator who is very supportive of industrial policy. He's very gung-ho. He's very happy that the Biden administration is, breaking away from the more free market approach and is taking a more interventionist approach. And I don't disagree with specific instances of like, I think it's good for the government to invest in clean energy, to invest in deploying solar and wind and other things. And I think it's good for the government, to some extent, like the semiconductor bet is one that I understand. I understand that investment. But I'm much more skeptical than Noah in terms of our ability to actually make it happen. In theory, it all sounds good. But I know that, like you said, it's coming wrapped in a package of Buy American policies. And Buy American is, for me, like kind of a keyword for a bunch of stuff that it's not just the literal Buy American. It's all sorts of federal rules and regulations and this extremely long process that it takes to source anything when you're the federal government. And, the environmental review process that you've got to do to buy anything or to build anything. And I'm just, spending the money doesn't matter if it doesn't produce enough, if it doesn't produce something valuable. And I'm worried that we're in that phase of like, we've allocated a lot of the money, but because of how poorly we manage it and spend it, it's just not going to have a lot of impact.
That makes a lot of sense. Let me add two things to it. One is that industrial strategy, industrial policy takes place in the political system, not in the world of venture capital. And the rewards and punishments are quite different in the political system. So especially in the case of the IRA, you have all of the Republicans voting against it and all of the Democrats, or most of the Democrats voting for it. That means Republicans are going to be highly on the alert for individual failed projects. And if you dial back again to the Obama administration, they did something not as ambitious, but pretty similar. They put a lot of money into green technologies, and some of it paid off quite well. There was one project, it was called the Cylinder Company, that went bust. And if you're a venture capitalist and you put a lot of money into 20 projects and 3 of them go bust, you'll be fine with that. And if none of them go bust, you'll think, I probably didn't have enough risk in the portfolio and I didn't make as much money as I should. If you're in the political system, one failure can be the face of the whole thing. And that definitely happened to Obama with Solyndra. Everyone looks back at that and say this was a big debacle, which I don't think it was really true, but the Biden administration is very much at risk of something similar. So, industrial strategy can fail on the merits. It can get bogged down by political constituencies who want their pieces of it, but it can also kind of succeed on some overall merits and be perceived as a big failure.
One other thing that I want to talk about in terms of just the grand economic picture over the last few years is the way that the economy is being distributed among the different, classes of people. We always talk about upper class people, the rich versus the working class. And it was a big focus for a long time, how is economic growth being divided? Who's actually getting the benefits of that growth? And it seems like there has been some movement under Joe Biden that for the first time in maybe a long time, that the working class seems to be actually accelerating at a faster rate than anyone else. Is that your understanding of the picture that we're looking at? And what view do you have of is President Biden responsible for that? Or is it just kind of how the economy happens to be right now?
I'm not yet confident I know the answer to that question, or at least the latter part of the question. There's been a lot of talk and a lot of unhappiness about the growth of income inequality in the country and about the falling level of heavy industry jobs and manufacturing jobs in the country. And both of those things actually either plateaued or began to turn around during the Obama administration, 2010, 2011, and so forth. In fact, the COVID year, 2020, was the only year in the last 12 where we didn't have manufacturing job growth, and nobody really recognized that. Likewise, inequality, as I understand it, leveled off, though it didn't decline, beginning in 2011. So to some extent, a lot of the arguments are about phenomena of the 80s and 90s and 2000s. And
like I said, we're always fighting the last war, right?
Yeah.
We're always fighting the war from 10 years ago.
In current situation, I think you're absolutely right that these last 2 years have been quite good ones for working class people. And unemployment has been very low. People have been coming back out into the labor force who had sort of given up. Wage growth has been pretty high. I don't think a lot of people are enthusiastic because it's been accompanied by inflation. But nonetheless, I think these have been fairly good couple of years for workers. And one way to see that is, over these past couple of years, lots of people have been quitting their jobs and taking new ones. The level of layoffs has been very low, and the level of people quitting their jobs has been higher than ever before. So that means people feel the worker environment is pretty good. If I leave this job, I might be able to get a better one. And for all of the intense attention to why don't we have more manufacturing jobs? I talked to manufacturers in the last 2 weeks. I talked to two, and both of them said the biggest concern they have now is people aren't taking the jobs that they want to hire people for, that it's hard to convince people to go in for manufacturing careers. So I do think you're right, that workers, at least as employees and wage earners, if not as consumers, have had a pretty good time in these last couple of years. You have to wonder, fiscal stimulus running down, Federal Reserve raising interest rates, presumably growth will be a little bit slower. Is this sort of a transient period that reflects the very big push the government did to keep the economy alive during COVID? Or is it really a change in the weather and the currents of the economy that mean it will be, we're on the cusp of an era of more balanced growth, and this Biden administration likes to say, and it's very kind of appealing pitch, growth from the bottom up and the middle out.
So we're going to be coming up on time soon here, but before we get to the final question, I want to ask you, are there any areas of, economic policy that have happened under this administration that we haven't mentioned yet that you think deserve a call out as like they're either interesting or they're important, or, maybe it's a small area, but it's something that people should pay more attention to? Is there something we haven't hit yet that you think about a lot that you think is worth talking about?
Let me put it this way. When I look at the administration's policies, I see a lot to like. I see a lot of things that have worked pretty well. I see a generally positive current situation. I have a different view of trade policy in the administration has gone forward with, but I understand they've explained why they're doing this, and I may disagree, but there you go. What I would like to see and don't see is a couple of things. One, in the Bidenomics speeches and documents, there's not a lot of attention to the non-industrial working class, to healthcare workers, to hairstylists, and to security guards and bus drivers and retail workers. There's a pretty strong assumption that a worker is or wants to be someone with a factory job or a construction site job, and I just don't think that's necessarily correct. I would like to see things like, I know you've worked closely with the Colorado government. They do a lot of thinking about licensing rules and how do you make it easier for a hairstylist to start her own place? How do you make it easier for someone to start a food truck? How do you make it easier for someone coming out of the criminal justice system to get a job and to find a place? And I think that's not something I see or hear in the administration rhetoric. And I really wish it were, because it's great to have more manufacturing jobs, but they are 11% of all U.S. employment, and they're about 9% of employment since COVID, and they're not, I think, going to be the core of employment in the United States. I think you have to meet non-industrial workers where they are and figure out what it is they want and have government policies and reform or abolition of government policies that make things easier for them. Similar case with rural America. This is the part of the country that's most disaffected with the Democratic Party. It's a part of the country that's been badly damaged by Trump and trade in particular. Where does production agriculture fit into their vision? What is the approach to the Farm Bill? How is the infrastructure program, both heavy physical things and broadband, going to bring money and jobs into rural counties? It would be those sorts of things. Or I think there's some gaps in the audience that Bidenomics is thinking about, which I would like to see more of, and I think would really kind of round out a policy that has been successful in bringing the economy back from COVID and has some big ideas about industry, but also has some important gaps that I think need to be filled in before the presidential campaign, and that there's time to fill in.
I think that makes sense. I like the emphasis that, manufacturing is not the only thing in the world anymore. As politically salient as it is, as much as we like to imagine the glorious past when everyone had a manufacturing job and, could buy their house with 1 year's of wages and whatever other imagined past we used to have. But we are running up on time now. So I want to ask the traditional final question that we always ask. And that is, where can people go to learn more? I will start by recommending that the report you're putting out, I don't know if it will be out yet by the time we release this podcast, but we will certainly be promoting it on our social media accounts, Twitter and all that. So we're going to be pushing that. And when it comes out, everybody should check out this report on Bidenomics from Ed Gresser. But other than yourself, what other sources would you recommend for people who just want to understand the state of the economy, who want to understand Biden's economic viewpoints and what his policies have done? This could be books, blogs, people to follow on social media. Where do you get your news?
Okay, well, I think newspaper reporting, the Post and the Times and so forth, Bidenomics is quite good. I recommend very much reading the blogs and pieces put out by the Treasury Department and the Council of Economic Advisors for the administration's point of view. Those are very conscientious agencies about getting statistics right and putting them in the right context. They'll give you the administration's take on their own policies, but do it in a very responsible way. There are a number of think tanks that do quite good work. Peterson Institute looks a lot at industrial policy, kind of from a critical point of view. Those are a few that I would start with. And I think it's always good to read government's primary documents. You have to read them always with some care because they're meant to be persuasive. They're not purely analytical documents, but they do give you a very good sense of here's what the administration wants people to think about its policies, and here's what it believes itself. And then you can look at the think tanks and bloggers and check it against them.
I actually think that's a great point about primary documents, because so much of the stuff that I recommend to people is kind of analysis. It's Matt Iglesias or Noah Smith, or there's one that I like called the Pricatas from Joey Politano. And all these are really great sources where other people will read stuff and summarize it to you. But, sometimes there's no substitute for just going and reading the direct government sources yourself. So it's good to keep that in mind.
Yeah, and I do follow data pretty closely. And I read Biden administration material. The more political the agency, the more sometimes you see a little bit of lily-gilding, but they're pretty responsible, and they'll give you here's what we think and here's what we think the president should get credit for. But it'll be pretty it'll be accurate factually, and it'll be backed up by some reasoning. And I think that's always a good place to start.
Well, it will be interesting to see how these conversations continue over the next year as we get into political silly season and the 2024 election. Obviously the economy will be a hot topic, so we will have to see where it goes. Hopefully we do continue to have a hot economy. I want to say thank you one more time to my guest, Ed Gresser, Vice President at PPI, focusing on trade and the economy. Ed, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thanks, Jeremiah. It's always great to be here.